Sometimes the lectionary is not kind to us. From Ezekiel to John's Gospel this Sunday, we are invited into graveyards. Perhaps invited is too gentle a term. We are pulled into places of death by the scripture texts themselves. We tend to steer clear of cemeteries. Long gone are the days when families held picnics among the tombstones, seeking to include their departed loved ones in the festivities of the living. In generations before us, when epidemics ravaged families and mothers often died in childbirth, sharing meals in graveyards was a way to acknowledge the dead, to keep their precious memories vibrant among the living. Ezekiel recounts a vision of his, unsettling and forceful. The hand of the Lord is upon him. He is grabbed. He is blown away by the wind or spirit and set down in a God-forsaken landscape, an unnamed valley littered with bones. Here the text teases us a bit with ambiguity. Is it the Spirit of God at work? Is it a holy wind, divine breath? The Hebrew word for ruach has all three meanings. And moving among those words can offer us new angles by which to hear the prophet's voice anew today. Forced to walk in this valley of death, Ezekiel is surrounded by dry, bleached bones. No hint of life remains. And back and forth he walks among this grim sight. We're offered no clues as to whose bones these might be. Was there a great battle? And are these the remains of soldiers who were slaughtered there? Could there have been a horrific plague? And this some mass grave dug in haste and fear by frantic survivors? The identity of the bones remains unclear in the beginning of the story. Now, Ezekiel was a prophet in the days of Israel's exile in Babylon. He is a prophet prone to strange and disturbing dreams, and this one is no exception, as Ezekiel, bewildered and a bit off balance, is overwhelmed by the sight around him. God shocks the prophet with a question. Son of man, can these bones live? Well, the rational answer is, of course not. This is a field of dried up bones. This is a valley of death. There is no promise of life left here at all. Ezekiel, wisely we might think, is hesitant to object directly to God, and so a give and take ensues in the story. God gives direction to Ezekiel to prophesy over the bones, and then the breath of God sweeps in. Each step of a way, there is this divine dance of sort between the Spirit of God and the words of the prophet. Each interaction bringing those bones just a little bit closer to being restored to life. As the vision comes to a close, Ezekiel reveals the meaning behind his strange dream. His people, separated in exile with their holy city in ruins, have given up. Our bones are dried up. Our hope is gone. There's nothing left of us, they cry. And yet, even though the people can see no way out of their devastation, the prophet urges them to listen for the yes that only God can speak. In times of overwhelming struggle, hope is a rare commodity. When we're all just trying hard to cope with the new normal, any dreams of life beyond our isolated realities can be lost, tossed into some corner, left to gather dust. And yet Ezekiel's vision seeks to shock us into new possibilities. Doubt and uncertainty are just underneath the surface of the story, as when we see Ezekiel hesitate to issue his own understanding of the possibilities of life emerging. Nudged by God, or perhaps better, pushed by the Spirit, Ezekiel comes to a new understanding that even in the midst of despair, he can hear God's yes. That the creative force of God's Spirit is always at work to bring about life, even when we can't see it. Now, our gospel reading may lack the barren landscape of bleached white bones, but we still find ourselves in a graveyard. This time it's outside Bethany, a place of danger for Jesus now, close in proximity to Jerusalem, the place of Jesus's impending passion and death. It is a turn in the story, both in place and in time. Jesus receives word that his friend Lazarus is ill, and yet Jesus delays in traveling to be with him. And by the time Jesus and his disciples arrive, Lazarus has already died, and his body is buried in a tomb. There is so much to this story. We might want to focus on Jesus's delay. Why would he pause? Why would he hesitate to make his way to be with his friends in their moment of distress? Jesus hints at the connection between Lazarus's death and his own. He says, this illness does not lead to death, rather it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, glory in John's gospel is not a glory of pomp and circumstance or power, but it is the glory of the cross, the glory of a life given up, crucified. One of my seminary professors noted that this delayed travel of Jesus is, quote, a journey to give life to Lazarus, but a march of death for him. We might turn our attention to the conversation between Martha and Jesus. Her stated faith in Jesus' presence, her hope in resurrection, and Jesus' startling words in return, I am the resurrection and the life. Not in some future tense, but here and now, Jesus is life. Still, we could pause and reflect upon the depth of emotion in Jesus' interaction with Mary, the tears, the pain, the misunderstandings, and the strong ties of friendship as the tears of Jesus join with Mary's and mingle with the other mourners at the tomb. There is so much richness in this story. Through the years, I have come to read this story through the eyes of one of our most beloved painters, Vincent van Gogh. You can see his painting of this story, The Raising of Lazarus, at the top of our worship page. It's held in the collection of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And while we're all being careful and staying at home, you might even take time to virtually visit the museum through Google's Art and Culture app. You can use the Street View and wander through the whole museum, and then virtually stand in front of this painting. The painting has faded through the years, but even so, we can still see the evidence of his trademark vibrant brushstrokes. His brother Theo had sent him some prints of the great masters, and this is Van Gogh's riff off of an etching by Rembrandt. Van Gogh was the son of a Dutch Reformed minister and had for a time thought of entering the ministry himself. And in this painting, he zooms into the moment of the tomb's opening, depicting Mary and Martha and the still gray Lazarus with his eyes barely open. In this triangle of connection between the three, we find hope and doubt, life and death, all moving and connected with one another. Lazarus, with his head leaning slightly against the wall of the tomb, is painted with a bit of red beard and red hair. Perhaps this is a clue to Van Gogh's thoughts as he painted the story. Could he be imagining himself as Lazarus? One who has been experiencing death and yet still holds to the hope of life. The painting was created while Van Gogh was a patient in the small asylum of St. Paul's outside of St. Remy. The asylum was in a converted monastery. This was one of Van Gogh's most creative periods, and yet a time of extreme mental anguish. Medical accounts state that he tried to poison himself with his own paints while he was there. None of his friends, nor even his brother Theo, who paid for his stay at the asylum, visited him while he was there. He was alone. The pain and distress of this moment of his life is intimately woven into his artwork from that period. Henry Nouwen once remarked, "It seemed like all my life Vincent van Gogh has been my own spiritual guide." It's as though he went through it all, the failures, sufferings, and joys. You know he understands and puts all of that into a painting just for you. Now we may notice that Jesus is not in this painting. It is the close family unit which is portrayed. Outside of the enclosure of the tomb, the sun beckons, however, just above the light blue mountain range. The sun radiates light and warmth, extending just inside the tomb itself. Is the sun a stand-in for Jesus, the light of the world in John's Gospel? Here in this painting, Van Gogh depicts life and death in the balance. Are we like Lazarus? Are we bound by our own grave clothes, shut off from the world? Are we shrouded by death? Or do we see ourselves in Mary or in Martha? Are we in the shadows of grief as the figure near the bottom corner is, her face turned away from our gaze? The figure in the center in green has her arms raised. Is it a gesture of amazement or one of encouragement saying, "Get up, Lazarus, get up"? Van Gogh invites us to enter into the story ourselves, to find ourselves in the graveyard. How do we respond at this moment? Will we act from a place of trust in the one who declares, "I am the resurrection and the life"? Will we say yes to Jesus' direction to unbind Lazarus and let him go? By saying yes in our own time to joining in the process of bringing life into places touched by grief or despair. Our Lenten journey is nearing its ending. Today we may be lingering in graveyards, in valleys strewn with the dry bones of days gone by, or walled up in loneliness. Yet in the face of death and despair, God's creative spirit is always calling us beyond the brokenness, to hear the yes that only God can speak, to breathe deeply of the loving presence of God. A presence which is at work even now, breathing life into us and blowing freely through our world. That is the abundant life which Christ brings. That is resurrection. It is the life which we celebrate even now, especially now.